If you had a microscope and could look at a piece of a leaf, you would see thousands of tiny openings which branch out until the leaf has all of the materials it needs. What happens now?
Just when you thought there was no more content left for this class, there's one more bonus video, okay? And I just want to fill your brain holes with a little bit of extra information because I think this will be useful. So today, let's just quickly talk about 3 confusing things in After Effects. Number 1, the difference between masks and mats. Okay, this is something I get asked about a lot, and obviously masks and mats are pretty similar. Both deal with the transparency of a layer on screen on some level, all right? And I think in general, students like masks better, and it kind of makes sense to me because masks are kind of quicker and easier to work with, I feel like. Like if you just want to cut one thing off of off of a layer, you can make a mask really quickly in 5 seconds and be done with that, right? And, and if you want to just add one thing on for a layer, for example, too, you could also just have an add mask, right? So it's really quick and really easy. You can use your shape tool or your pen tool to make masks. It's really easy. And it also masks have additional properties for animating like feather and expansion that mats don't really have, okay? So masks are great. I mean, I use masks all the time. But there's just certain situations when you need to use mats instead of masks. And mats, I feel like students don't like as much because, as you know, you have to create an extra layer to make a mat, and then you have to have like the 2 layers together always, and you can't break that order. So it creates extra layers, and it creates this kind of situation where you have to maintain something in a certain way, so that it's sort of an annoying thing, right? Mats can be challenging and annoying and difficult at times, right? But masks are kind of limited in the way that you can animate them, all right? Like, for example, you can animate a straight line really easily with a mask, but to animate a curved path or something like we went over, that would be annoying and a nightmare, okay? And the other thing is that when layers move a lot and you need a different part of that to be revealed, that's more of a situation where you'd want to use a mat, okay? And mats are also great for, any kind of texturing, and just mats are really great for a lot of things. I use mats all the time, and I think as part of your work in After Effects is you just have to get used to using mats and just get used to the idea of having that extra layer on top and always having the mat above the fill and just always making sure that if you kind of edit one, you edit the other. All right? Let's jump into After Effects and I'll show you a little bit more about how to work with mats versus masks. Okay, so I've created a situation here where you could use a mask or a mat, and I want to talk about kind of the differences, right? So I have this ball, and I want it to move across this square, and I only want it to be, on screen or revealed when it's inside the square, right? So I could, for example, I could use a mask for this. And let me do the position animation first. So let me move the ball over here, okay? And I'll make a position keyframe. And then let me just go like 2 seconds or whatever, and I'm going to move it over here. Okay, so far so good. And then in order to mask this now, when it's sort of above this, we'll get into an issue with masks that I think you'll agree it makes them kind of a bit of a pain in the neck. So if this wasn't moving, it would be very easy to put a mask around this box, although if it wasn't moving, I wouldn't really need to. Okay, so, but with a moving situation like this, the only way you can mask this off and have this work is to counter animate the mask, okay, which is kind of weird and confusing and not a situation I think you really want to be in that often, but here we go. So I'm going to use my rectangle tool, and because I want to make a mask on this shape layer, don't forget I need to press this button here, otherwise I make another shape layer, right? So on my ball layer, I could get in here now and redraw this shape with my rectangle tool, right? And now you see that the ball is, because it's over here, it's not within this mask, and so it's not on screen. So I could Option M and make a mask path keyframe there, right? Now, when this moves over, it's still not on screen because the ball is now over here, but the mask is here. So what I need to do now is, like I said, counter animate the mask to move it back here in the same exact position where it started, so it looks like it's not moving, but it actually is, right? I've sort of animated the mask to stay in the same place while the layer moves, like that, all right? And, you know, that works, and that will definitely do in a pinch, but it's a little bit silly. I'm going to make this 1 second, because this is ridiculously slow. Okay. And obviously, you know, part of the disadvantage of this is, you know, if I change this, right, if I change the timings on this, now it completely messes up the look and the illusion of this, right? So I'd always have to remember to change that, right? And if I change, for example, like, you know, the speed or how far this goes and moves like this farther over, now the mask also is broken too, and I would have to reanimate that. So this is not an ideal situation, I don't think, for doing this, right? What would be way better is a matte, okay? So I'm going to delete this mask. And, you know, it's very easy with a matte to make this work. All I would need to do is take my square and duplicate it and put it on top, right? And then just track matte like that. And now that's all I need to do to create that animation. So in this case, I think you could see that a matte is just a lot easier. And if I were to take this and change the timings, it doesn't matter. The matte still holds, right? So I could do whatever I want to make this slower, or I could change the values, or I could have this like totally different animation now, like a diagonal animation, and not have to worry about trying to diagonally animate the mask to stay on there or whatever, okay? So that's one way in which mattes and masks are very different when the layer moves, okay? So that's kind of the primary difference, I think, between mattes and masks, other than, you know, the options that you have as masks, like feathering and, you know, that kind of thing. I did want to talk about, for a second, because we never got to it, about Luma mattes, which are down here, okay? And let me just say that Luma mattes and alpha mattes are similar but different, okay? Alpha mattes deal with the alpha information, which is just the transparency information of a layer. I think we went over this before, but for example, with this square, you could see that everything outside of the square is completely transparent, which means that there's no alpha information there, or the alpha information is saying transparent, right? And anything inside the square is completely opaque, so After Effects knows that that's got a full alpha information there. That's why alpha mattes work the way they do, right? Wherever there's no alpha information, the ball is not on screen, and wherever there is, the ball is on screen, right? Okay, so Luma mattes work differently. Luma mattes work with black and white luminance values. That's why they're called Luma, okay? So, for example, if I were to make a new pre-comp here real quick, right, and I were to make a black solid and put it in the background, okay, and let's make this a little interesting. I'm going to make a white rectangle, and I'll make a couple white rectangles just for the heck of it. I'm going to make something like this, and it really doesn't matter, okay? But just say I have something like this, and it's black and white, and that's my comp one, and I can call that my Luma comp if I want, okay? So now let me take this in here into this composition, and I'm going to delete out my squares, okay? So right now I just have this ball that moves like this, and actually I think I'll move that more like this, just because it'll work better with the other one. Right, so now I'm going to take my Luma comp and I move it in on top, right? And so that's right there, and right now obviously you cannot see the ball at all through that, but, and this still has the alpha information on, but that doesn't really matter. If I change this to a Luma matte now, you would see that wherever there was something white, right, the ball is transparent, and wherever it was black, the ball can be seen on screen. It's fully 100% opaque, right? So, sometimes you don't always have alpha information for a layer. That's what Luma mattes are for in this one example, is for, using a different kind of information to create that track matte, right? So that's kind of cool, and you can always invert the Luma matte as well. And so wherever it was, wherever it was, the opposite, wherever it was black, I guess, now I'm losing what I did. Yeah, wherever it is white in a Luma matte is where you can see it, and wherever in an inverted one, wherever it was black, that's where you can see it, okay? So that's kind of an overview of the differences between mattes and masks. I hope that's useful. Number 2, that continuous rasterization button. Okay, this one is definitely a little bit confusing, because this button means multiple things. All right, which is kind of odd they made it this one button, but here we go. Let's go over all those things. So obviously, as we've talked about before, here I have Illustrator layers, okay? And if I take this, just say my number 2, and I scale it up above 100%, and I get really big, or above 100% at all, it starts to look super crappy and pixelated, right? We went over this. But if I press this sunshine button, or the continuous rasterization button, it looks sharp, right? Okay, so that much everybody knows. So let me set this back down to 100. Now, just say, so this is called comp 1 that I've got this in. If I take comp 1 and I pull this down into another comp, right? So in a way I've kind of pre-comped that, or I've nested that comp inside this comp. 2 different terms for it. And now, on this comp, the whole layer, I take this and I scale this up above 100%, okay? Now, you can see here that it looks crappy again. And if we go back to comp 1, we can still see that layer 2 happens to have been turned on, right? So if I have this on even for all these layers and I pull that into another comp and I scale it up, it looks crappy again, right? So how do I get around that? Well, the answer is I press that button again and then it looks good. So if I set this back down to 100, here's the first important rule about that button, is if you're using it to scale up Illustrator art rather, above 100%, then you always have to make sure that this button is turned on for the original layers in whatever pre-comp that's in, the original instances of these layers in your first pre-comp in After Effects, and then you have to turn that button on for every other pre-comp instance where those layers exist, okay? So that's one part of it, is that kind of rasterization of Illustrator layers, right? But another thing that button controls is flowing 3D information from one pre-comp to another, okay? So this can get a little confusing. So obviously, in comp 1, if these are not 3D layers, and I've pulled that into comp 2 like this, and I'm not rasterizing it, and I make this a 3D layer now when I rotate in 3D space, this will rotate like one solid flat layer, right? As you'd expect. Let me set that back to 0. But now if I go back to comp 1 and I make these 3D layers, and actually let me take a second to kind of set this up in a slightly more interesting way, okay? So let me spread these out into the position depth a little bit. So let me push the 3 back, and then let me take the 1 and let me push that up, okay? Now I'll just move that over here, and for whatever reason, just to be neat, I'll move this over here, okay? So those are now all 3D, and they're separated out into the Z space, okay? So now if I go back to comp 2, you'll see that those now appear to be separated out into space, as you'd imagine. And let's just say if I have this turned off, right? And obviously, if I try to rotate, I just get the regular rotation like this, no big deal. But if I turn this on now, right? Now, I do get this as a 3D layer, but when I rotate this, I'm still rotating it as a flat 3D layer, okay? But, and I think guys, you know where this is going, if I turn the rasterization button on now, and I rotate this, check it out. Now it's flowing the 3D information from my original pre-comp here into comp 2, okay? So that's kind of mind-blowingly awesome, which is you can have things in pre-comps that are in 3D space, which I just called 3 comps, which I think is kind of awesome, and then put those, or nest those, or pre-compose those within another composition that also has Z information and depth and 3D information going on in it, and those can fit perfectly into the 3D space. So that's really cool. All you have to do to remember to do that is make sure in the original instance the layers are on in 3D as 3D layers, and then this is a 3D layer and the continuous rasterization button is pressed. Okay, so the final thing that I want to talk about that this button helps with is that in some instances it can kind of be like an uncropping tool. So this is kind of cool, and sometimes will really save your butt. So just say I have a situation like this and I create like a new shape or whatever, and for whatever reason this shape is like this, and it's like longer than the comp, right? And if I now go into my, I've pulled comp 1 into comp 2 here, and right now obviously you can kind of see that this pre-comp is cropped right here at the edges of the other comp. But, and so like for example, if I scaled this down, that would be the edge of that. And even if I went back in here, for example, and I made like a solid and I put it on the bottom, now when we went back here, right, it's all contained kind of within that. But if I press that continuous rasterization button now, I can extend this artwork past the boundaries of the original comp, which is really nice because I made this bigger, right? And if I even make this bigger, for example, the bigger I make this, the wider it can get here, right? So that's actually really, really cool for a situation. For example, if I delete this and I delete this, sometimes you might have a situation, I don't know, just say you have an animation, something starts over like off screen or whatever, and then just say it moves across the screen to off screen again. And you know, for whatever reason, you shrink that down. So just say this was 100%, it wouldn't really matter. You know, that would just move across the screen there. But if you were to, like, for whatever reason, shrink this down, now you could still have that move from there to there, or you could even get back into the original comp and now move this like further there so that it eventually is like off screen here too, which is really amazing. And if you never knew that, that possibly just blew your mind, because that is super useful. Okay, so yeah, that continuous rasterization button, it has a lot of functions and it does a lot, so you definitely need to be prepared for that. So I hope that reduces some of the confusion around that. Number 3 is After Effects rendering versus Adobe Media Encoder rendering. Okay, and I get asked about this a lot, and you know, once upon a time, I don't think it was even that long ago, maybe 5 years ago, there was no Adobe Media Encoder, and the only rendering that you could do from After Effects was in After Effects, right? So that kind of made sense. And then at a certain point, they made this new thing called Adobe Media Encoder. And what the cool thing about that is, you can basically use it 2 different ways. You can render from your After Effects comps directly in Adobe Media Encoder, which I'm going to call AME from now on, okay? So you can render your comps from After Effects directly into AME, or you can render something, for example, lossless from After Effects, and then pull that QuickTime movie into AME, and then compress it from there, okay? Now, the advantages of rendering from After Effects are obviously that you're staying in one place, okay, and you're not changing places. But the advantage of working with AME is that A, you can keep working in After Effects while rendering in this other program, so that might save you some time. And the other thing is that you can apply certain compressions or codecs in AME that you just can't render with in After Effects.
I'm pretty sure at this point.
Which is a little bit annoying, but you know, in your finished comp here, you go to Add to Render Queue, and then do all these normal things, right? But if you don't want to do that, for example, if you are really busy on a job and you need to render something while you're working on something else in After Effects, okay, which happens occasionally, or if you tell your producers that you can render in a different program, then this will always happen, so maybe don't do that. But if you want to, you know, render an Adobe Media Encoder, you just go up to Composition and Add to AME Queue, okay? And when you press this, absolutely nothing's going to happen. And you might think, oh, that didn't work because sort of like nothing's really happening for a while here, and still nothing's happening. And finally something's happened, which is that it takes a second to open AME and then kind of drop the composition information and everything in there, okay? And you know, however you had set, for example, your work area, and however you had set all these things up, just like in the regular render queue, this will now work in the AME queue, okay? And it puts your things here in a queue. And the cool thing about AME is that it's got these system presets, okay? So if this isn't open, for example, this preset browser, you would have to go up here to Preset Browser, to Window, Preset Browser, right? And then that'll open here. And in this folder here, you see all these categories. Audio only, which is really useful. Broadcast, which is really useful. Devices, which is really useful. And, you know, and web video, which is really useful. Those are the main categories that sort of I use. And let's dig into this a little bit. So, you know, broadcast. This is really the one that I'm going to use the most. And, for example, when you render from After Effects, you cannot make things into a .mp4. That's just one of those irritating things, but you could do it really easily here in AME. And what you would do is go into Broadcast and go down here to the H.264 folder, okay? And in this case, this is an HD 1080 2997 comp, right? So I would just take this setting here, okay, and drag that and put that there. That happened to be the setting that was on there already. and now it will render, as you can see, as a .mp4 with those settings. And if you want, you could double click on this, which opens this dynamic link connection, and this also always takes a really long while to open, which I'm not sure why either, but eventually you'll open these export settings, and then you can get in here and change things about this, and change like the bitrate settings and some advanced stuff or whatever if you ever wanted. Or you could, for example, just export the video by checking off the audio button. You could do a lot of things in here, but you don't necessarily need to if you use these presets, because these are really awesome and you will get to know them rather. And let's see, some of the other ones are, like I said, audio only. Like if you need to render something as an MP3, you could do it this way and convert like an AIF to an MP3 in AME. That was a lot of acronyms. The other one that I think is really useful are these devices. So sometimes you get asked to render things nowadays for like, an iPad or whatever, or for an iPhone or Apple TV. And all these settings are in here, okay? And like even which phone and stuff. So this is really useful for rendering for devices and also for the web. And also you don't just have to render for Apple. It could be for a Nook, for example, whatever that is. Or for TiVo, for example, if anybody still has one of those. Okay, so AME is really easy. And one of the things that I really use this for is not necessarily for rendering from After Effects, like I said, but if I have just say I'm making something for a client and I need 5 different versions of it. Okay, I'm making it and they need a master archival backup copy that's lossless. That I would render from After Effects, okay? And then I would take that and pull that into AME and make multiple versions of that. For example, something for an iPad and something for, you can also get in here and do like for web video rather, like Facebook, like for our Facebook group, for example, you can render out something smaller. 720 is the same ratio as 1080, but it's smaller. And then, so it'll be 1280 by 720 instead of 1920 by 1080. Or for Vimeo, for example. And for Vimeo, you could do it at 1080 or any of these smaller sizes. Or for YouTube, right? So anytime you need to make multiple versions across multiple platforms of something in After Effects, the easiest way is definitely to use AME. Okay, there's just no way of setting this up as well in After Effects. So that's pretty much what it's for, I think. And it will definitely save your butt in lots of different ways and at lots of different times. I find that rendering through AME sometimes takes a little bit longer than After Effects for whatever reason, but when you make things .mp4 H.264s as opposed to a .mov H.264, you'd be surprised at how much smaller that .mp4 file is than the .mov. So thanks for watching this, and I really hope this answered any remaining questions that you might have had about these 3 kind of confusing things in After Effects. Thank you so much.
If you had a microscope and could look at a piece of a leaf, you would see thousands of tiny openings which branch out until the leaf has all of the materials it needs. What happens now?